On January 15, 1953, a groundskeeper in Stanley Park in Vancouver, British Columbia, stumbled upon human remains near Beaver Lake. They were found hidden by thick brush and covered with a woman's coat. Nearby was a woman's shoe, a lunchbox, children's flying helmets, and a hatchet identified as the murder weapon. The remains belonged to 2 children who had died as a result of a severe head wound. It was believed they were killed about 5 years earlier in 1947 or 1948. Unable to determine their identities, they became known as the Babes in the Woods for the next 69 years. Anthropologist Erna van Beiersdorf molded busts of the 2 children, which were assumed to be a male and a female for many years. Decades later, 26-year-old Allie Brady was flipping through the family photo album when she discovered a family photo of her grandmother Diane with 2 brothers she never even knew existed. When Allie asked her grandmother Diane who they were, she found out they were Diane's younger brothers, David and Derek. Allie says she was told that the 2 little boys were taken away by the ministry and handed over to social services because their mother Eileen was too poor to look after them. Diane remained with her mother, but her brothers were never heard from again. She recalled her mother's poverty and how they used to jump out of windows at places they were renting in Vancouver to avoid having to pay because they were so poor. But when Allie's mom pressed her mother for more information, Diane would tell her, "We don't talk about that," or "That's in the past." She did say, however, that she didn't know who her father was or who the father of the boys were. So, in 2020, Allie uploaded her information to various genealogy sites, including 23andMe and GEDmatch, which is used by law enforcement. She also sent in a sample of Diane's DNA to MyHeritage in hopes of finding out if her great-uncles were still alive or had children or grandchildren. She had no idea that she would be helping solve one of Vancouver's oldest cold cases. Allie didn't have the boys' birth certificates or know the year they disappeared, but she knew that their half-sister Diane was born in July 1937 and was the oldest of the siblings. Detective Honeyborn, who was the cold case detective on the case in the 1990s, removed the remains from public display at the museum because it was deemed inappropriate. He cremated the majority of the remains, except the skulls, and buried the boys at sea in a ceremony with the police captain. It was originally thought that the victims could be a boy and a girl, but a tooth was extracted in 1996, which proved that they were both boys. Since the remaining bones had been handled by many people over the years and been on display at the Vancouver Police Museum, the DNA was contaminated, making it difficult to get a sample. Redgrave Research Forensic Services, however, were able to succeed in extracting a DNA sample from a small bone fragment of the older boy. The Redgrave team was able to identify the maternal grandparents of one of the boys and construct a family tree by comparing the victim's DNA to people who had submitted their own DNA, including Allie and her grandmother Diane. In February 2022, Allie's mother was approached by a Vancouver police detective who told her that her uncles, David and Derek Busquet, had been officially identified as the 2 skeletons that had been found in the park all those years earlier. She had no idea and had never even heard of the cold case, Babes in the Woods. David was born June 24, 1941, and was 6 years old when he died. Derek was born February 27, 1940, and was 7 when he died. Derek and David were descendants of Russian immigrants who came to Canada at the turn of the 20th century. They lived in Vancouver and had a family member who lived near the entrance to Stanley Park where the bodies were found. Police say the brothers lived in poverty and attended Henry Hudson Elementary School in Kitsilano along with their half-sister Diane. They were never reported missing, and police always believed that the mother of the 2 boys had killed her 2 sons and covered them up with her coat. They speculated the mother went off and killed herself. But after determining their identities, the investigation showed that their mother was Eileen Busquet, who had died in 1996 at the age of 78. Whether she killed her sons or not still remains a mystery. Their mother, Eileen, was born in Alberta and had a fraternal twin named Doreen. She had several surnames, and at the age of 31, her last name was Dalton, same as the boys, but it doesn't appear to be a married name, and it's not clear where it came from. It's believed all three of her children, Diane, Derek, and David, were born in Vancouver. Detectives told Allie's mother that they couldn't find any records to indicate that the boys were taken into the custody of Child Protective Services as she had originally been told. Eileen was described as a lovely, gentle woman who loved animals and often babysat little kids. Her family does not believe she would have killed her boys. Many speculate that social services did take the children and were placed with someone that could not tolerate them after being removed from their mother and killed them. Although it is unknown who took those boys' lives, at least they finally have their names back after nearly 75 years. On June 11, 1976, the body of a woman was found in the Mississippi River near Lilydale, Minnesota. Authorities estimated she had died weeks earlier. Although forensic anthropologists were unable to determine her race and ethnicity, they believed that she was between 25 and 30 years old. She was wearing shorts, socks, and shoes, but the cause and manner of death have not been disclosed. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Lilydale Jane Doe 1976. In 2021, a DNA sample reserved from the remains was processed to create a DNA profile that could be uploaded to GEDmatch. The DNA Doe Project took on the case and used genetic genealogy to try and determine the woman's identity. The closest DNA matches were distant cousins. The DNA Doe Project was able to trace the Doe's paternal line back to early 18th century Luxembourg to find a common ancestor who had immigrated to the United States in the mid-1840s. On July 3, 2021, the team arrived at a potential candidate for Jane Doe. 45 years after her discovery, on February 4, 2022, the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office and the DNA Doe Project announced the remains were those of Roberta Seyfert. Roberta was born in 1954 in Tucson, Arizona, and she would have been 22 at the time of her death. As a young child, Roberta's father, Charles, loaded the family into a dilapidated school bus to travel to the Promised Land. They traveled north, and Charles spoke of being on a mission and told his sons, ages 10 and 14, to keep their guns ready. He said they would travel to Alaska and then on to Israel, where he would accomplish his mission. On the way, they took turns sleeping on an improvised bed in the back of the bus. Their father would tell them about the book of Revelations and that he wanted them to be among the 144,000 to be redeemed. On the way, on or about April 22, 1958, they stopped briefly in Carlsbad, California to visit Charles's parents, but he was eager to get on with his travels. They then drove into Capistrano Palisades, California, where Charles planned to stop and visit his sister. While there, he accused his wife Arlene of slowing them down. Arlene secretly gave his sister Minnie Phillip a note that read that Charles was mixed up and being led by spirits. Charles then rushed them all back onto the bus and left. Soon after leaving his sister's home, a sheriff's deputy ordered him to pull over. Arlene took 4-year-old Roberta towards the door and asked Charles to let them out as he told the boys to get ready to shoot. Arlene escaped with little Roberta after Charles threatened to harm them. Charles and his 2 young sons, Tommy and Alan, were then involved in a shootout with sheriff's deputies that led to the death of all 3, along with 1 deputy. Another deputy involved in the shooting would thankfully go on to survive. The rest of the story still remains a mystery, as investigators are unclear what Arlene and Roberta's lives were like after this day, or what led to Roberta's body being found in the Mississippi River. Although it sadly took 45 years, Roberta finally got her name back. On June 20th, 2003, human skeletonized remains were discovered along Craig Drive near Highway 29 in Lawrenceville, Georgia, in a storm basin when city workers opened a manhole to clean out the storm drains. The individual was discovered with drug paraphernalia nearby. On the body was a short-sleeved cotton Christopher Hall's shirt, originally white or beige, with a fine blue plaid pattern and athletic socks. Forensic investigators determined the remains were that of a white male between 45 and 55 years old. Authorities believed that they had most likely died sometime between 2002 and 2003. Unable to determine his identity, he became known as Gwinnett County John Doe 2003. 18 years later, in May 2021, pathologist Dr. Carol Terry of the Gwinnett County Medical Examiner's Office reached out to the DNA Doe Project for help identifying the remains. A DNA sample was submitted and a profile was created and uploaded to GEDmatch. Months later, genealogy work began on the case, and the DNA Doe Project's volunteer investigative genetic genealogists were able to use DNA matches to identify the John Doe. It was determined within a week that the remains possibly belonged to Gordon Rexrode. Gordon was born November 2, 1932 in West Virginia and also lived in Alabama and Georgia before he disappeared from public records in 2002. He was estranged from his family, who described him as a very kind person. The connection was never made to the missing persons report they filed in 1998, possibly because he was actually around 70 years old when he passed and not even close to the estimated age of 45 and 55 years old that was originally given. Gordon was homeless and his family had become concerned when he didn't call or check in for a long period of time. It's unknown how his body ended up in the manhole, but there were no signs of foul play. On October 26, 2003, human remains were found by hunters near Redgate Road in a somewhat remote and wooded area close to Marion, Montana. Most of the evidence was located at the bottom of the cliff, but there was at least one bone remaining at the top of the cliff. It was believed that the remains belonged to a white man between the ages of 18 and 42, and he had likely died up to 8 years prior. Also, near the body were a Smith & Wesson .422 and a black nylon holster, a duffel bag and fanny pack with a water bottle, a marijuana pipe, a handheld electronic poker game, sunglasses, pages from the book Phases of Gravity by Dan Simmons, and a bottle of Aleve. Investigators determined that the bottle of Aleve would have been manufactured between June 1994 and January 1997. Investigators also discovered that the Adidas shoes worn by the John Doe would have been manufactured in May of 1995. The firearm serial number was traced to a man living in Sandy, Utah, who claims to have bought the gun in January 1994. He initially claimed that he sold the gun between March and June of 94 to one of two gun stores. Years later, the man claimed that the gun could have been sold at a later date in 1994 or 1995 to a pawn shop. Either way, the only location of the gun that was ever known by authorities was Sandy, Utah. Without any missing persons matches from the area, the case went cold. Unable to determine his identity, he became known as Marion Flathead County John Doe 2003. Years later, the deputy coroner decided to see if investigative genetic genealogy could be used to identify the remains. In 2008, the DNA Doe Project took on the case. After obtaining a DNA sample from the partial skeleton, a full DNA sequence in bioinformatics created a DNA profile that was uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. The only matches were very distantly related people. DNA Doe Project volunteers struggled for a long time to locate the most recent common ancestor among the matches, eventually identifying the correct branch of the family tree. Authorities followed up with 5 closest DNA relatives and were able to narrow down the Doe's family to the descendants of a couple in Indiana who had migrated to the Seattle area. They were then able to make a connection with the father of the deceased. On February 6, 2022, the DNA Doe Project and the Flathead County Sheriff's Office announced that the remains were those of Stephen Edward Gooch of Washington State. Stephen had been reported missing by his family in 1996, 7 years before his body was found. He would have been 30 years old when he died. In 1995, at the age of 29, he left the area of Bethel, Washington, and went to San Diego, California, and was possibly headed to Las Vegas, Nevada, but his family never heard from him again. The talented genetic genealogist worked tirelessly for almost 3 years to be able to bring Stephen back to his family and give him his name back. On May 2, 2014, a deceased middle-aged man was found in bed in his apartment on Main Street in Oakland, Maine by his landlord. He had rented the apartment under the alias Alfred Jake Fuller, with a date of birth November 8, 1970. But it turns out that Alfred was not his real name or date of birth. He had no state-issued identification, and there was no record in any database of a man with that name and with that date of birth he provided on his lease agreement. Inside his apartment was a fugitive recovery agent card, but it is speculated that the card was a fake. Also near the body was a prepaid black Visa card. The only ID in the apartment was a bail enforcement agent card, but the U.S. Marshal's Office had no one by that name. There is also no record of an Alfred Fuller with the given date of birth in Maine, New Hampshire, or Vermont. It was estimated that he was between the ages of 40 and 46 years old and weighed approximately 255 pounds. He had light brown hair and gray curly hair 2 to 3 inches in length with a very short mustache and goatee. He was found wearing a Harpoon Brewery t-shirt with a brewery with locations in Boston and Windsor, Vermont. The shirt is for a running and biking event that raises money for the Vermont Food Bank, and Harpoon Brewery is often one of the sponsors, so it would easily be found in a thrift store. He was also wearing a Grand Pinnacle of Solomon pendant and a crucifix. The autopsy revealed the man had an enlarged heart and his death was ruled by natural causes. Unable to determine his identity, he became known as Alfred Jake Fuller. For the next 4 years, authorities would struggle to identify him and locate his family. On September 26, 2018, blood samples were sent into the DNA lab for whole genome sequencing. Weeks later, bioinformatics work was performed by Greg Mangum of Aradyne Research Corporation, which produced a file suitable for upload to genealogical databases. The file was then uploaded to GEDmatch, which predicted that he might possibly have blue eyes, and although this is not always accurate, the bioinformatics expert verified predicted color with additional markers. Following intensive genealogy research by the DNA Doe Project, cousins in Maine and Canada were found. They determined a possible identity to the John Doe, and on December 28, 2018, the identity was confirmed by the medical examiner, but the family requested that his name be withheld. The person that now lives in the apartment stated that Jake was a private person, but any other details about him or his true identity have not been released to the public. On September 28, 1990, a property owner bush hogging his field came upon something unexpected. A human skull lying under a fence line next to the roadway along Joshua Road near the intersection of Mountain View Road in Stafford, Virginia. Deputies who responded to the scene confirmed it was a skull, and from the look of it, it had been there for an extended period of time and showed no signs of trauma. Further searching turned up no additional remains. Examiners determined that the skull belonged to a white male between the ages of 15 and 18 years old, and it was believed that the remains had been there between 1 to 3 years. At the time, they couldn't determine a cause of death, but believed it may have been violent or unnatural, and the manner of death was ruled undetermined. Over the years, many leads were pursued, and a forensic facial reconstruction was created in hopes that someone would recognize the teenager. Then in 2011, DNA testing was done on the remains by DNA International and the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, but no matches were made. In May 2020, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children asked if the DNA extracted could be sequenced and searched against genealogy databases to find potential family members. In late 2021, Othram Labs performed genealogical research with funds provided by philanthropist Justin Wu of Las Vegas. Othram provided the sheriff's office with a possible name and location of the victim's father and brother who were in the Norfolk area. A detective contacted the family and learned of Timothy Mangum. The family said they hadn't heard from Timothy for a number of years prior to 1990 when his skull was found. DNA samples from the family confirmed the John Doe's identity as Timothy Allen Mangum, born September 15, 1968. Even though his family hadn't heard from him in many years, they never reported him missing. Since then, authorities learned that he attended Lake Taylor High School in Norfolk, Virginia in April 1983 after withdrawing from the Chesapeake public school system 3 months earlier. At one point, he moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee to live with his mother, but came back to Virginia to the Tidewater area. He then attended the James Berry Robinson Institute in Norfolk and was enrolled at Lake Taylor High School for his sophomore year. Not much is known about his disappearance or circumstances around his death. Many questions are still unanswered, including why he would have been in Stafford County, hours from where he had lived in the Norfolk area. Sadly, there is no pictures of Timothy available, but he finally got his name back after 32 years.